last year here on Breakfast, we were having conversations about the detection of lead in the water supply of two coastal Dunedin towns, Waikouaiti and Karitane. I remember speaking to a new mum who was distraught at the idea that the formula she had mixed with the tap water had in some way harmed her baby. Well, this morning we continue that conversation around lead with the release of a UN report that says that New Zealand kids had a relatively high level of lead in their blood. So what does lead poisoning look like, and what are the risks we should be aware of? We are joined this morning, very grateful for the presence of Professor of Toxicology from the University of Canterbury, Ian Shaw, and mother-turned-lead awareness advocator, Ananda Card. Thank you both so much for your time this morning. Professor Shaw, can I start with you? And if we can look at this report that came out, it talked about lead being one of the most dangerous environmental toxic substances, which obviously you know. New Zealand scores poorly on lead poisoning, as 3.8% of our kids in Aotearoa have levels of lead in their blood over 5 micrograms per decilitre. How surprised were you by that report?
I suppose there's two answers to that question, really. I wasn't surprised because we're a country with a lot of old houses, lots of old paint, and lead is present in old paint. So that didn't surprise me. But it did surprise me because there are lots of other countries around the world with old houses, and for example, the UK and Finland, and they're right at the very top of the low levels of lead. So that was a surprise, but the fact that we've got lead isn't a surprise.
Okay, so talk to me about how big of an issue this is then in Aotearoa, because you're talking about older homes. We know we've got in every town, every city, our older homes. So how big of an issue is this for us?
I suppose you should look at two things, shouldn't we? The first is where lead comes from, and then secondly, what the sort of levels that were found mean in terms of the health of kids, particularly because lead affects kids more than adults. And, I think we probably know this, but we may have lead pipes in our plumbing. In fact, the word plumbing comes from lead, and that they may be leaking lead into the system. Demolition material from houses that might have been painted before 1970 with lead-containing paint, and particularly before 1945. Lead shot from shooting ducks right in the duck season now, and that falls into water, and the water might be used for drinking water or might go into the groundwater. And lead flashing on roofs, and a lot of people like myself, I live in an old house, collect rainwater, and of course it runs over the lead flashing. So that's where it can come from. But what do these levels mean? The levels that were reported were above 5 micrograms per 100 mils. And that's the point at which we think it's above normal, because there's normally a very small amount of lead in the environment and a very small amount of lead in us because we're eating food and drinking water that came out of the environment. So this isn't the sort of level that you think, right, everybody's going to be very ill who's got that level of lead. Not at all. But it's the point at which a little red light goes on, and we think we need to look at this more closely. So lead can do two things. Right at the very top end of the scale, it can cause anemia because it stops the production of hemoglobin, which is a red blood pigment that carries oxygen. We're not talking about that here at all. At the low end, and this is the very low end, we could expect neurological changes in the development of the brain, which is why it particularly affects kids, because kids' brains continue to grow from the time of birth up to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. So they're the problems, I think.
Ananda, can I bring you in here, because I know that this has impacted you as well. I know you did a story with our Sunday program about lead within your home. So are you able to tell us your story and how it impacted on your babies as well?
Well, my story is that I quite accidentally discovered that there was lead throughout our house and soil. And through that realization, I realized that, so my son had elevated lead in his blood. His blood was 4.8 micrograms per deciliter, which is just below that 5 level.
Yep.
But all the research says that even at levels as low as 2, you can see detriments to cognitive effects in the brain. So I knew that that was not okay. And we started looking at what we were going to do with our house and realized that there really wasn't very many safe practices for renovating lead or getting rid of lead. So we had to learn everything we needed to know to do it ourselves to make sure to keep our kids safe. Because renovating and lead dust from paint are the biggest risks to kids, but people don't really realize that. And so standard practices can definitely put kids at risk. So we had to do all this work ourselves on our house, and we have no effects on my kids. Like, the vast majority of lead poisoning has no effects at all until possibly years down the line when they have trouble learning in school, or they're a bit aggressive, or having outbursts and impulsivity, ADHD, that kind of thing. So we're still kind of waiting to see if we see anything with my son, because he's 3.5 now. So every time he's like, hitting us and having tantrums and thrashing around, it's like, well, is this normal toddler activity, or could it be lead poisoning? And still way too early to tell.
So, Ananda, you found lead in basically everywhere in your house, right?
Yeah, well, not in the painted walls, like on the jib, but underneath the walls and in all the painted surfaces and the varnished wood and in the soil, like so many places.
Gosh. Professor, can I bring you back in here? And I'm listening to Ananda's story. And I just wonder how much of an issue this is for us here in Aotearoa, and how concerned we should be about lead.
Can I just kick off by congratulating Ananda on all the stuff she's done, because it's been amazing. She and I talked on the phone quite some time ago, so well done. It is a big issue, and there's no question about that. We shouldn't have lead levels above 5. And as Ananda says, you can still get effects of lead even at lower levels than that, but the epidemiological evidence for that is very, very scant indeed. I mean, one of the biggest problems, and Ananda knows this and she's brought this up, is lead paint. And when you renovate a house, you sand the paint down, and the lead forms of powder, and it goes all over the house, into the carpets, into the walls, all over the place. The kids crawl around on the ground and get doses of lead. That's where it's coming from, almost certainly. How you can stop this, I haven't got a clue. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it? Unless people are aware of these issues. I mean, something we always do in our house, if ever we have anybody, a tradie in, to come to do something where they need to sand the paint, we ask them to use one of those vacuum sanders. So at least they collect the lead. But even when you look at those working, there's still dust coming off. So it's very difficult. I think that awareness is really important, so that people know that this is an issue, and therefore they minimise the exposure as much as they can.
I have to wrap this conversation up. Professor Ian Shaw, thank you so much for your voice on this and for your time this morning. And I want to come back to you and finish with you, Ananda. Professor Shaw talked about, how do you stop this? I don't know, but he did talk about awareness. So if you wanted to say anything to those listening, to parents, what do you want them to be aware of?
I want you to be aware, for sure, that lead paint and renovations are the biggest risk to children, but also anything that goes in a child's mouth, like whether it be soil or toys or your keys, like so many things have lead in them, and only things that are from like approved big brand toy manufacturers are really the only safe thing that should be going in a child's mouth. And I would really say pay attention to what you're exposing them to, and check out my Facebook page, because I always have ideas on there. And I think we really need more regulations to protect our kids, because like our asbestos regulations, to protect people from asbestos, from renovating, we need to have the same thing for lead, which is what they have in the US. And also, we're not checking our kids for their blood. We need to have a lot more blood testing of children, like national screening program, or even just population-based studies to find out exactly how bad the problem is, because we really don't know.
Ananda, thank you so much for your time this morning. I wish you well. I wish you and your bub well. Ananda Card, Lead Awareness Ambassador. And also Professor Ian Shaw, thank you also for your voice on this. Tēnā kōrua.